Well, how is everything going, John?
Everything is going great.
Yeah, I remember the last time I spoke to you. I don't know if you remember it, but I think we were just about to record a video for you, and then someone turned the microwave on. And you remember that?
I do remember that.
Yeah,
Yeah, luckily I quarantined her to her room, so there will be no microwaving
yeah,
at
good
this
stuff.
point in time.
It was a particular moment, Drew, and um, it was just like one of those things where when you start like recording video and stuff, you're
Yeah,
like
yeah.
everything else needs to be quiet, and there's one of those moments where it's like ding, and you're like, oh
Yeah.
god, what's going on? You know.
What was it that happened to? There was one of these episodes where someone started like trimming a hedge or mowing a
Yeah,
lawn or
my next door
drilling
neighbour.
through the
Yeah,
wall behind you or something.
yeah, my next door neighbour started to trim their hedge, and just to give you context, this is about probably like 2 o'clock in the afternoon or something. It's like it's like what are you doing on like a Wednesday? And I thought my laptop exploded. I was just like, oh my! And we had this poor guy on from Australia who must have been like, we're like an hour into this chat. We're quite deep in, and all of a sudden I just get like, I was like, oh my god, what is going on? I was like, Drew, you're gonna have to take over. My laptop's dying, and then I this kind of went outside. Like this guy's just like trimming his edge. I was like, got a podcast, mate. What's going on? Not that professional, as you can tell already, John. But
That's quite all right.
it's got us this far, and so we're going to pursue with it. But John, feel free to kind of introduce yourself, because I'd imagine there'll be lots of people. Well, lots of our listeners are UK based, for example, and so when we bring on, I don't know, some sort of agency founder like Joe, for example, last time, everyone kind of knows who she is. So it's a bit like doesn't really need a lot of introduction. But for UK listeners, design theory might be something they never looked at before. So yeah, I don't
Yeah,
know if you've.
absolutely.
So feel free to introduce yourself to the masses, John.
Sure. So first of all, Brad and Drew, thank you for having me on the podcast.
No
It's
worries.
pretty exciting. I've watched quite a few of the other episodes, and I'm really flattered to be part of that roster. So thanks for that. And
No worries.
in terms of my background, I've been working professionally as an industrial designer for about 10 years now. Most of my work tends to focus on things that fit on or around the body. So any sort of wearable or wearable tech, whether that's AR glasses, regular glasses, medical devices, surgical devices, masks, pretty much anything you can think of that fits on the body. I've probably had some hand in designing, although I've done a lot of other things. I've done some, industrial design is a pretty broad field. So I've also done things like designing food truck interiors, faucets, restaurant interiors. Like it's kind of been a weird variety of things, but I seem to have settled into this sort of wearable tech space.
It's a cool place to be. Drew talks very passionately about catheters, don't you, Drew? Sometimes. So I feel like it's one of those things where design is, you're absolutely right. It's such a broad field that, I mean, I do a little bit of work with a company called Joseph here in the UK, and I've never seen a group of people more enthusiastic about a bin before in my life. You go to the office, this swanky space, and there's just like these 7 or 8 people just looking around this bin, and you're just like, guys, it's just a bin.
But at the same time, you're not the designer, but you're a consumer or something like that. So Jess gets a bit lost on how excited I get about Brabantia things. Right. So if I'm like, we're moving into this new place, and I was getting super excited about maybe getting hold of a Brabantia bin in the kitchen.
Oh, nice.
I just, what? It's a bin. I'm like, why are you going to spend that amount of money on a bin? What's wrong with you? Like, but wait, let me tell you about the details. Just one of those things. You can get super excited about the most mundane things when you're a designer. Is that what kind of brought you into it, John?
Absolutely. So there were a couple of things that brought me into it. My brother actually studied industrial design. Now he does game design, and I think he actually went into user research more recently. But that was a big thing. I was always building things as a kid. Another thing is that in regards to the interest in the mundane, I can definitely relate to that. Did you design catheters for Coloplast by any chance?
No, but I'm very, very familiar with Coloplast, intimately familiar with Coloplast catheters.
Just wondering, because I know Native Design over in the UK did a bunch of catheters and a bunch of other work for Coloplast, and they're actually quite nicely designed.
Mm-hmm. No, they're really, really good products. They are, yeah.
Yeah, we're pinning our hope on a sponsorship one day.
I genuinely can't say too much about this because I've done so much work on, well, not on Coloplast, but on. I mean, you can see on my LinkedIn profile who I've worked for and all of that, right? So, I mean, it's no secret that I've worked at Convatec for a long time in basically trying to create a worthy rival. I'm not going to say any more about that because of IP and because I know that some of my former colleagues listen, and I dare say there might even be people who I worked with. No, got to shut up now. Got to just shut my mouth.
Well, that would be an awkward editing that bit out. But yeah,
leave it in. That's the reality of it. It's like this is the bit when you're having public conversations about things you've designed. There are times you have to go, I can't say anymore.
Yeah.
I understand.
I used to every now and again you'll start dealing with like a couple that are in industrial design. So like they find love, in their first design workplace or something. And it's amazing because when they start working for like two different companies, they get home and they can't talk about work because neither of them can talk about what they've been doing. And so we should probably try and bring on a couple at some point. There are a couple of design couples out there that are kind of working colleagues on stuff. And it's an interesting kind of thing. But John, whilst you're also a designer, you're also a bit of a YouTuber as well. I don't know if that's a fair assessment to make.
Yeah. So I actually teach at California College of the Arts. It's just a part-time thing, usually 1 or 2 classes a semester. And the reason why I do that is because that has been the single thing that has really elevated my design sensibilities, because design is a very intuitive process. It's very hard to articulate why you do certain things. And in order to teach effectively, you need to be able to articulate, the rationale behind these decisions. So I think it's probably the best thing that I've ever done in terms of just my own design practice, but it's also helped to benefit a lot of people who are maybe starting out in design, and even people who are actually pretty far along. They just like to watch them because they think it's an interesting or differing perspective. So yeah, go check out Design Theory after this video is over and you've listened to all of the Design Truth podcasts. Go check out Design Theory. It talks a lot about just
a link.
Oh, is it up here somewhere?
I love
there,
it.
I don't know.
Yeah, somewhere around here.
Oh yeah, let's bring the fictitious graphics department. Follow the link up here.
I don't know. It'll be there somewhere. But so I'd love just to talk a little bit about YouTube and stuff, because I said to you on a message earlier, John, and I find it really fascinating that when I put up a thing on Instagram, and occasionally I'll put something up which says, who would you like on as a guest on Design Truth? And maybe we'll try and get them on. One of those kind of things. And sometimes we get interesting suggestions, but I always get 2 suggestions that come up every single time. And quite commonly, one of them is Johnny Ive, by the way. Who,
right? Oh man, I hope you can get Johnny Ive.
I mean,
that would be amazing.
Then we'll get
good luck.
I mean, we're number 1 in Ecuador, so I mean, if Johnny does want to come on and expand his kind of remit out there, then that's always a good start point. And then the second one is always Sam Does Design. So those are the 2 names that people, when like, and you think if you went back like 20 years and someone was to ask you of the 2 designers you would love to hear for an hour, one of them, it wouldn't be those people, would it? In the sense of like a design YouTuber and the guy that's like the mastermind behind Apple. It just seems 2 extremes, don't you? But I just find it interesting that there is this kind of sense of like, when you're putting yourself out there a bit more, that people want to listen, I just find it all such an interesting thing of like, and I messaged Sam earlier to him to mention that, and he kind of laughed at it, and it was like, yeah, I want either to listen to either Johnny Ive or Sam from London. It's like, it just makes me laugh.
Did you did you ask him if he wants to come on the show? Is he going to come on, you think?
I think he's coming on. Yeah, I think he's coming on. And again, another guest with a USB mic. So we're pretty buzzing with that. 2 in a row. 2. We're just ecstatic that someone's got a USB mic, to be honest.
You can't underestimate the power of audio. But one thing that's interesting about Sam is that maybe he's just starting out in design, but he actually has really good insights. He's very humble in his approach, and I think you can actually learn something from Sam Does Design, because even if you are maybe a little bit more junior, you still have a lot to offer just in terms of documenting and showing your process.
Yeah.
So I think that's really valuable. And I
Mm.
think there's definitely something that younger designers can learn from Sam
Yeah,
in that
absolutely.
in that regard, without a
Yeah.
doubt. Just sort of, I think you're right. Putting yourself out there is a big deal, even if
Yeah.
it's not sort of positioning yourself as this expert. I mean, he's just saying like, look, this is what I know. If you want to check it out, great. If you don't,
If not,
that's
bugger
fine
off,
too. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, John, on that, you mentioned your brother studied industrial design, but who were did you have heroes coming into it? How did you know about it, and who were the names that brought you in, or was there something that you saw that you just fell in love with that you thought like, I don't know, I won't.
That's a great
answer
question.
Who are your
So-
inspirations?
Yeah.
So in terms of inspiration, it's important to note that in addition to my brother studying industrial design, he's 8 years older than me. So he was always building things when he was a kid, like, 8, 10, 12 years old. And so I would basically go in and just destroy all of his creations, being 8 years younger than him, by trying to help build them out further. So that was a big influence. But another big one was actually my mother. So as a second career, she started out in banking, investment banking. And then her second career was in interior design. She studied at the New York School of Interior Design, which is one of the most prestigious interior design schools in the country. And I was constantly just sort of sitting behind her on her chair, watching her do her like color homework, or doing floor plans or hand renderings and things like that. So I think that definitely played a big part in it as well. Just watching my mother go through school, that was a big thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and we've talked about this before, but just you may have heard, you may not. My older cousin, who's like 20 years older than me or something like that, he was a graphic designer. He was the only person I knew out of all the adults I knew in my family that didn't absolutely hate his job. Everyone else worked for the 2 weeks a year that they could go to Spain or something. But he had nice things. He had decent clothes and decent car. And I was like, well, what is it that he's doing? Why is everything so much better for him? And yeah, he got to basically draw things and put together packaging and things like this. And I was like, okay, cool. I'm up for that. I'll do that. And then I was like, oh no, I want to design cars. And then I think so like the Escort Cosworth came along. You're like, holy shit! Like, what is this thing? And you get lost in. It's possible that you could draw cars for a living and have them made. And then later on, I was like, I don't want to just draw cars. I want to draw lamps and chairs and obviously catheters.
Yeah,
of course.
catheters.
I'm sure the career advisor said, "Look, you'd be a really good You'd be a really good catheter designer."
Catheter designer. What about knee components? Yeah, you draw the shit out of a knee.
Well, let me ask you a question. Do you think that your impression of what the field would actually be like is in line with the reality?
No, no. We were again. This has probably come up a few times on the podcast, but there was a show on the BBC or Channel 4 or something like that when I was a teenager, and that was about industrial designers.
Was that the Seymour Powell one?
It was the Seymour Powell.
Yeah, it's a show called Better by.
I think it was Better by Design. Yeah, I always remembered it as designs on your.
There's a couple on YouTube, John. You should check them out. There's one of a razor and one of a shopping trolley, I think, and it's so nostalgic. It's pure 90s. Yeah.
I'll write that down.
Yeah. Seymour Powell is a big agency here. So yeah, but you're absolutely for people of your generation, Drew, that was seen as like inspirational kind of content.
It is. It's like hearing, I don't know, like when you hear a band and they've got this whole new guitar sound or something like that. And you're like, I don't know, probably like the first time for a lot of people would have heard a band like Slipknot. You go, whoa, that's so heavy. What on earth is that? And then you discover that there's loads more about that and around it. But it's like it's a spark, and it opens up a whole new avenue.
Yeah.
So that probably has to be the headline credit for me. But then, you sort of start learning more and looking at, okay, well, why is this chair this shape? And you start hearing these words that turn out to be people's surnames, and it's very, very cool.
I'll throw a question to you, Drew. Then, if we kind of keep on the topic of YouTube, if we look at this generation coming through, does an Instagram page sit as the equivalent of your experience watching that program as a young 15, 16-year-old chap in Chester?
Almost certainly, and I'm definitely qualified to speak for the current generation of 15-year-olds.
But I'm just throwing it out there. Is it like seen as like, you know, your YouTube channel, Design Theory? Is it like, what are the pieces of content now that a fairly aspiring designer would look at? They probably would. It could almost sit as that equivalent where we could look back in 10 years' time and say, you know, how did you get involved in design? And someone would probably say, well, I watched this guy on YouTube. And, you know, it really...
That would be so nuts.
Yeah, and it was the thing that... Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, it's interesting because industrial design is still a fairly obscure field. Most people still don't know what it is. It's certainly, like, all of the information is much more accessible now, but it's still relatively obscure. So there is an opportunity there to basically evangelize it. Although, to be fair, in terms of traditional job paths, I don't know if it can really support like a huge number of people going into the field, which is a whole nother issue, at least going into traditional industrial design jobs, right? So that's another thing that could be interesting to talk about.
Well, we've just next week, John, me and Drew have assembled a bit of a mini team to go to. We've been asked to go, or not go to, but a university here in the UK called Nottingham-Trent are putting together a final year showcase. And they kind of came to us, Drew, didn't they, and said, well, what do we do? You know, we haven't got people walking around in their business cards, you know, potential employers going to new designers. So what can we do to get industry feedback on our students' work? And we had this kind of crazy idea that where we would get clients and people in on a Zoom call, and then the Miro session would come up and work would come up, and then we'd review it, we'd record it, we'd then send it to the students. And one thing that struck me was just the volume of students on this course.
It's nuts.
And it's, you know, Nottingham-Trent, lovely people, absolutely love them. But I wouldn't say they're like a top tier university here in the UK. But I've full of admiration for them. They've been a great bunch to us, Drew. But just the volume of students that are going through it, and you think, where are these people going to go? You know, and I haven't seen their work yet, and they could be awesome designers. But it's like, you're going to have to pivot here. You're not going to get that traditional industrial design job.
And that's okay. You don't have to. I mean, you know, not everybody is meant to work at who's one, like Samsung, let's say. Not everybody's meant to work at Samsung, and that's totally okay. You can start your own company. I mean, industrial design is inherently just I can't speak. A divergent method of thinking. I didn't even drink anything, and I can't speak. It's a divergent method of thinking, right? So, I mean, you can treat your career as essentially a design project and figure out, like, okay, what do I do with these skills, or how do they apply to other aspects of business, and where can I best leverage my skill set? And it's an incredibly valuable skill set. It's just that I think people are very narrowly honed in on, like,
they want to work. They want to work at an agency.
At Samsung. But there's so much more that you can do with the profession. I mean, I make YouTube videos, and sure, it's really not my primary source of income by any stretch. But I mean, that is an example of something that you could explore. I mean, it's definitely worth thinking about from that perspective, I think.
Yeah, so go on. I'll pick up on that because, like, I didn't have much of a clear plan. I did, when I studied it, it was called product design.
Are you telling me that Design Truth wasn't a plan of yours when you?
No, when I was 14, I decided what I need to do is meet a lad named Brad.
Exactly. Who probably wasn't even born.
No, so how old would you have been there? You would have been like, you would have been a child. I need like a child that eventually will grow up to be a lot taller than me, I suspect.
Yes, 16.
Because we've never met in real life.
No.
We live hundreds of miles away from one another. but there we are. Yeah, I need to make a podcast, which is something that I couldn't possibly conceive of.
Never heard of before.
Yeah, and then put it on YouTube, which is, imagine if, Channel 4 and BBC Two had a late night baby, and nobody was in charge of it.
Yeah, no one regulates the thing.
Public access TV, but, in an age where everyone's got pretty good cameras.
Mm.
Well, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, think about it. Even 30, 40 years ago, who would have thought that we'd all have cameras in our pockets? High resolution, high fidelity, 1080p or 4K cameras in our pockets. If you'd even combining a phone with a camera 30 years ago, would have been a completely ridiculous idea that made no sense at all. That's one thing that my friend Rafi always says. He's like, people would have laughed you out of the room if you said to combine a camera and a phone, but meanwhile, here we are. So
yeah. And then you take something like trying to get your house keys onto a device of that sort of nature. People are like, no, not having it. But how helpful would that be? Or like to take some of the facial recognition technology and put it on your door or a garage or a car, something where, like, if you've got limited dexterity or strength or whatever, those kind of things are super duper helpful. I don't know if you're just like really forgetful like me. Frequently shut the self-locking door and go, bollocks, my keys. Can I get into the window? All that kind of thing would be super helpful, but people are like, no, I'm not having that. That's a security threat.
Yeah.
What, to be able to recognize your face?
Yeah.
Anyway, you're right. There's just this hesitancy with all these things that turn out to be really good ideas. But yeah, something like a camera and a phone, I don't need either of those things in my pocket. So why do I want both? Why do I now absolutely need both of them at all times in my pocket? Otherwise, I'm going to freak out.
And these things aren't expensive either. If you think about kind of designers that want to get into this kind of thing, let's say there's someone out there that wants to start up a YouTube channel, because apparently people of a younger generation would rather be an influencer than a footballer now. Whereas in my generation, that everyone would want to play for United. They wouldn't want to now, but and I'm sure in Drew's generation, maybe sports. What would be that? But now
we still had football 30 years ago.
Yeah, but is that what people wanted to do when they grew up?
Yeah, I would say like the main difference for things like that, like if you were going to be a musician when I was a kid, you were going to learn how to play the guitar, whereas now I don't know, maybe. Like you'd want to dance to something.
Learn how to use the keys on the laptop, which puts the beat together. I don't even know. But now most people kind of growing up, they want to be influencers. They want to be online personalities and stuff.
Who's left to influence?
If everybody's an influencer, then who's being influenced?
Yeah.
Influence the influencers.
If you're not paying for it, you're the product. So like, it's not a job. It's like that's a service to a company. Like you're the problem.
Yeah. I don't know about.
I personally find it fascinating. I just like, even my mum, she'll like watch some YouTuber that's like buys bits around the house or something, and she finds it fascinating. Like, and she's a 55-year-old woman that can barely use the iPad, but she finds it absolutely fascinating that someone, buys paint pots and then kind of puts it on the screen, but she doesn't know she's been influenced because now she's gone and bought the same color that this YouTuber, but she's so unaware of how it all works, but is a pawn to that process. I just find it fascinating.
So go on, John. Who or what is the influencer that has like crept into your brain and made you buy something that you didn't realize you needed?
Oh, well, that's going into very subconscious psychology, so I don't know that I'd be able to articulate it. I do tend to read a lot of reviews online, and I do go on YouTube when I'm going to buy a camera or something. Like the camera that I'm using right now to record, for example. I looked at a ton of reviews online. I don't know if there was if I can recall a specific person. There is this one guy, I think his name is Drew, who has really good gear reviews, but yeah, I mean, I think nowadays nobody buys a product without reading at least some kind of a review, just as an example of how one could influence somebody through, just a product review. That
Yeah,
alone is huge.
I mean, putting a podcast together is not the most expensive thing in the world. You know, you
Yeah.
buy a mic and you buy a webcam, but even in that process, it's like, what's the best USB mic? I'll watch a couple of videos to see what people are saying, and you know, is it worth the extra 50 quid? Or I'll spend more time watching someone review it than when I'm
Yep.
in the checkout. And I just even just like there are certain brands like a Logitech cam. You think, oh, Logitech is going to be a half decent product, so you kind of lean towards it. But then, yeah, it almost any kind of decision you make in terms of purchasing something, you do kind of creep into that kind of, you want someone to give you that reassurance, don't you, that you are actually buying something that's not going to break down on you in a month's
Exactly.
time.
Yeah, and at least speaking for myself personally, I would not consider myself an influencer by any stretch, and I do not aspire to be an influencer. I would make those videos on YouTube even if nobody watched it, and if you don't believe me, there's proof of it, because basically for 2 years, nobody was watching them. Nobody was watching them for 2 years, so it's actually true. I get more out of them than anybody else, because once again, it helps me to articulate my design decisions, so that when I'm in a client meeting, I can tell you exactly why, you know, this thing is this shape or whatever else, and there's not going to be any debate about it. Now, the client can still decide to disagree on it, but at least I'm maximizing my chances of saying, like, okay, this is the right decision, and if they decide to go against it, that's on them.
So what do you do when that happens?
So we could almost role play it. How about Drew, why don't you be the stubborn client, and I say, okay, this is the design. Why don't you just say you want it to be,
you
want
want
5 millimeters thinner.
You want it in orange,
black
Drew.
to express my rage.
You want it in black?
I need it in black to express my rage. Why would I work in black?
Well, I think that it really depends on the overall brand aesthetic that we're going for. So this is an Apple pencil, right? You're Apple. Are you familiar with any other products that sort of have black in the Apple product line?
I'm going to just reach for my phone.
No. This is not supposed to be like I'm right and you're wrong. It's a conversation, because I'm not assuming that this has to be white. That's actually really important to note here.
What I'm going to do is take the position of a former, I would say like an in-house client, and go, okay, but my trousers, but in fact they're dungarees, and I want to try and, like, Brad, just as an aside, I need Carhartt to sponsor me because they're so expensive, and I have like just racks of Carhartt.
I'll work on it.
So if I don't know how many times I have to say Carhartt before it will just sort of.
I'll work on it. I will work on sponsorship. But go on.
The trousers I'm wearing today are black, and therefore the product needs to be black. Not just black, but the same black as my trousers. And I am really not stretching too far away from a real life situation here.
All right. So this would be I'd need to show a lot of restraint here, because the most obvious thing that I would ask is, are you going to buy 1 million of these things? Are you alone going to buy 1 million of these things? And the answer, of course, is no, but I wouldn't do that to a client. So maybe I would say, all right, well, who's our customer? I think that maybe could be something that we should focus on first.
It's a medical device project, and it's aimed at men. So they all wear the same things as me and think the same as me because I happen to be a man.
Okay. Well, let's talk about this a little bit. Have we done any research on the perceptions of color in relation to our product line yet? Just hypothetically, just run with it here.
Right.
You chose the most subjective thing. Color is the most subjective one, by the way.
Basically, what you're doing the same as what we did as our department, not just me, but I won't name them, but everyone else that was in that.
I'm just finding this amusing because in the industry I'm used to, like, client is pretty much king, and so the client dictates the cost of something quite early on, and if you don't abide by it, they'll just show you the door quite quickly, because we'll just find someone else that can do it then. That's just the world I've always ever really known, where it's like you can come up with these kind of, why do we do it like this? It's like, but no, this is how much it's going to cost. This is it, and if you don't like it, we'll just find someone else.
Well, that happens earlier. That happens
Yeah.
earlier in the process. Once you've agreed on a price, then they're essentially paying you for your expertise. And it's the same thing with you. You basically field candidates, and they're relying on your expertise to basically find the right person for the job. And we are essentially finding the right candidate for final production, the final product. So it's not too different.
So my challenge back is, okay, well, how long does the research take? Have you budgeted for it? Is it in the product plan?
How much is it going to cost?
Program? Who's responsible and accountable for that? How much is that going to cost? Is that coming out of your budget or mine?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that really what it comes down to is this. We're not like in character at the moment, but what I would typically do is basically figure that stuff out ahead of time in the proposal. So let's just pretend that we don't have the budget for this research and we didn't do this research. Then it becomes a lot more difficult because it is more of a subjective call. So I would tend to avoid that type of client at all costs. If there isn't some sort of fundamental research being done in the first place.
You try and screen that out early on, wouldn't you? In terms of like, is this the kind of client I want to work with? You'd probably have a good gauge quite early on whether that's going to be the kind of relationship you want to go down.
And you don't always have a choice, to be fair. Sometimes you have to take on client work that is not optimal.
Yeah, particularly, if you found yourself in a position where you've lost a couple of clients, or a couple of your key clients aren't doing stuff at the minute, or you're early on, you've just got to get the work in. And there are times, you're absolutely right, where it's like, well, that inquiry is coming and I've just got to take it. It's not my bread and butter, but I've got to give it a go, otherwise the lights aren't going to be on next month.
Right. So let's actually go back into character here. You want this medical device to be black, let's say. We haven't done any research. We don't have the research. We had to take on this client because we needed to pay the rent. Okay. So, Drew, have you ever heard that black is often associated with death before?
Yeah. And it can also, it can be associated with, let's say, necrotic flesh or the problematic symptoms. But like, you asked me to be stubborn, so asshole is what you get.
Okay, no, let's keep going with it. Okay, so let's keep going. So, okay, do you just want it to be black because you like black? Would you say that that's basically the reason?
Doesn't it? Goes with everything, mate. Yeah.
It certainly does, but in the context of medical devices, I think that you want to ensure a certain level of confidence and security with the product. Would you agree with that?
Love it. You're hired.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, no, you're right. I just think we could carry this on and spend all day doing this.
I think an awkward client at the end of the day is an awkward client, isn't it? It's like sometimes you're just banging your head against it, but if they want it in orange, they're getting it in orange regardless. Otherwise, you just walk away, don't you? And say, well, actually.
Exactly. So let's just fast forward. Let's just fast forward a little bit here. And let's just say, okay, I've laid out a bunch of reasons, Drew. If you still want it to be black, that's fine. This is your product, as long as you are aware of the potential repercussions. So, for example, one potential repercussion is that if this is a medical device, it may be harder to identify if the object is actually clean if it's all black, for example. It may be associated with death or necrotic flesh, if you wanted to be more poetic about it. Now, if you're okay with this, with these potential associations with your brand and your product, we can do it, but I want you to just be aware of them. And that's basically how I would end it. And I'd want it in writing, especially if it was something around engineering or tolerances. Yeah. If like they say, I want this to be 5 millimeters, and I say, there's no way it's going to be 5 millimeters, it needs to be 8. I'll say, okay, I can design it this way, but I want it in writing. I would definitely push for that.
I think you're right. Do you know what you've raised a really good point there, that it's one of those things that designers don't always like. And that's like very clear specifications, like from, there are living documents, but as long as you've got that traceable decision history, again, this is like medical device
This is pure medical device talk
pure
here,
medical
isn't it?
device.
Yeah.
No, it's assessing the risk. So you've got the decision. Client wants this. Okay, well, instead of just saying client wants this, it's okay. It needs to be in line with product branding, whatever. You phrase it in a more sympathetic way, but at least just address the risk of the the knock-on effects, and then if assess how problematic that risk is. I've heard people, and in fact, it was Steve at Small Fry used to talk about ignoring hippos, the highest paid person in the room. And they can often have, they have opinions, and a lot of the time a team will just sort of go along, and that's really dangerous. I think you need to be able to document your process, your decisions, and the risks that you're willing to take on.
Exactly. If it's something that deals with people's safety, like a medical device, I would definitely want that clearly articulated. One thing to remember is that as an outside designer, you might not have the full picture. So maybe they want it black because they need to raise funding for investment, and they know that it'll just look better in renderings, and they're not telling you that for some reason.
Yeah.
So that could be a reason why, like, you don't necessarily have the whole picture, especially if you're an outside consultant. So that's another thing to sort of keep in mind. They may be, keeping something from you for a whole bunch of reasons that are totally reasonable.
Yeah, it's a great point there, John. It's particularly today, I've been messaging quite a lot of mainly kind of clients, I suppose, the people that I work with from a business side of things. So we're quite keen to bring on people from business on the pod. So it's like all it's design truth. It'd be quite nice to bring on some kind of external influences, right? Of like people that work with designers, or people in quality, or someone in marketing, or because actually I think one of the big problems, I think, from my very limited understanding, is that designers love to talk about design to other designers, but they don't necessarily talk outside of that bubble. And so it's interesting that you pick up on that point, whereas we could have on some sort of founder of something who doesn't come from a design background, and they might make the point, well, actually, if we put it in black, it's going to look a lot better on our Kickstarter. So, and so in our self-interest, we're going black. And it's one of those things where hopefully when we can start bring on people that are from a marketing and business side of things, they might be able to give their own lived experience and perspective on it, which hopefully we can get, which hopefully we of more value to more value to the people that are listening, rather than just a designer saying how wonderful design is, because I think we're all a bit sick and tired of
I agree.
that.
I think that's really important, at least for the way that I like to work with my clients. I don't ever assume that I know everything or I'm right. I prefer to ask a lot of questions and understand what their goals are and figure out how I can facilitate it, because really the fundamentals of any good designer is understanding the problem. And it's not just the design problem, it's the business problem. So I think that's really, really important. I think that a lot of designers would benefit from taking a business class or just looking up, basic business principles online. So like, what is a click funnel, for example? How do you pitch an idea, and how do you make sure that you are catering to the interests of everybody in the room that you're speaking with? Because an engineer is going to care a lot more about certain things versus a designer, versus somebody in business, versus somebody in marketing. So I think really understanding who you're speaking to and what it is that they care about is super important if you want to be a successful designer, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, it's a good point there. And
are
you looking for something, Drew?
Yeah, I am, but I can't see it. Sorry. I've got my books behind me. I'm trying to pick out. There was a couple that I wanted to pick out, but without being able to show them, it's sort of.
That's okay. Yeah, when you talk about problem solving there, I was actually talking to someone earlier today. I get these weird messages sometimes now.
We all do.
Yeah, and it's like, can I have a conversation with you? Yeah, go on, and I'll have a chat with you. I haven't got anything else to do at the minute. So he was talking about his experience of moving from the UK to Europe, and that actually kind of in the UK, So kind of if you're educated somewhere like Loughborough or Brunel, the attitude is more around problem solving when it comes to design. So what you touched upon there. Whereas if you spend much time in Europe, it's a lot more ego driven and it's a lot more interpretive, and just from his personal experience. And it's not so much from an educational standpoint, it's not so much, let's try and solve the problem here. It's more about their interpretation of the chair and what it means and things like that. And that was just his observation from moving from the UK. I think he spent some time. He was working for PwC, but quite a well-respected designer, and just talking through the process of moving from one part and how design is different from one culture to another. I suppose that potentially might move quite nicely on to design out in the US. I know the US is a pretty big place, and you're not necessarily the voice for the US, but
no, I'm not. I am not the voice for the entire United States. Just want to make that very clear before I say anything.
Absolutely. But you are the first US guest we've had on. And so...
Can we just call you the voice of San Francisco and the surrounding area?
No. Do you know how many great designers are here? No, I'm not assuming that responsibility. Here's what I'll say. I actually have worked at a couple of different places. It's a very small sample size, but actually what you described regarding the more European sensibility for design is in line with my experience as well. I worked at a small consultancy where the founder was, I believe, Swedish. And it was very much like, this is how we're doing it. Like, I'm the boss. This is my vision for the product, and this is how we're going to do it. And there are other consultancies a lot like that too, based on what I've heard. I haven't worked at Fuse Project, but I've heard similar things with Yves Behar, where basically it was a very similar thing where it's like, people come to Fuse Project to work with me. Yeah. I am the sort of voice of this company, and what I say is what we're doing essentially. I think one thing that's important to note about American design, and I don't know if it's still as relevant today, but it has been incredibly pragmatic, at least early on. So let me tell you guys a little story. The thing that's really interesting is that in 1851, there was an exhibition called the Great Exhibition. It was in London's Hyde Park. And essentially, it was just an exhibition of everything that was happening across Europe, the US, the UK, et cetera. And in this, it was basically just a big flex for every single country to show how cool and well-crafted all of these objects are that they were designing. And of course, France and Germany came with like these beautifully crafted, absolutely impeccably styled firearms and things like that, and like pottery and vases and everything else you can think of, like festooned with all this filigree and stuff. And then the US or Colt specifically came to the exhibition with a bunch of buckets of components for the Colt revolver. And it was basically just a bunch of disassembled parts. And there was no decoration, nothing fancy about it. Very, very pragmatically designed. And I think that sort of informed the future generations as well, where maybe Europe and even the UK to an extent tends to view design more as an artistic pursuit, whereas the US perhaps is viewed more from a pragmatic perspective, where the real value here is that you have all of these individual discrete parts that can come together, right? And it's sort of highlighting the beauty of this manufacturing process, not the beauty of the objects themselves, because they were not beautiful in the traditional sense. So I don't know if that's really bled into design now, because it's 100 years later, but it's certainly interesting to think about.
Yeah, we had a few listener questions, John, where we said you were coming on, and they said, well, what's the difference? What's the difference between design in the UK and design out in the US? I think the first difference would be that it's a lot bigger, and so there's many different facets, I'd imagine, of like different cultures and different philosophies and things like that, whereas we're in the UK, it's quite a small place, and so a lot of the people are educated in a similar way, or they come through similar systems, and so a lot of it's quite similar, right? Obviously, there's a couple of different exceptions, and maybe different industries, things are a little bit different. But in the US, it's just on such a bigger scale.
Yeah,
that, so maybe people don't cross over as much, I'd imagine.
Exactly. Yeah, I've never been to the UK, so I can't speak for it. I've been to Europe, a few different countries. But just for some perspective in terms of geography, I think if you like the US in terms of like the width of the country could span from Portugal, like all the way past Moscow. Now, of course, there's a unifying government and a unifying language, but think about all of the different cultures between Portugal and Moscow and how radically different they are. It's pretty similar with the US. I mean, San Francisco is like this little tiny microcosm of a bubble of some like naked people running in the streets and stuff. And then you go to the Midwest, where it's much more polite, much more buttoned up, much more conservative, and there's everything in between. So it's hard for me to even say what the US design even is.
Are there like design hubs, John, where like in certain parts, for instance, in the UK, like London's a hub naturally, and maybe some other big cities, but I'm presuming that San Fran's going to be a bit of a hub. But are there large parts of the States where actually there's hardly any design? So like, although it's that big, but this size, they don't really do a lot. So it's all kind of over here somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, a lot of it is in California, specifically San Francisco. Portland, Oregon is about 10 hours north. There's a lot there. Seattle is another huge design hub. A lot of it is based on the West Coast because so many tech companies are based out of here. And that's where a lot of the work is coming from for most of us. Same thing with like biotech, medical devices, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, there are hubs.
So when you mentioned somewhere like Oregon, I'd imagine that a lot of those places are just founded from Nike, and just like someone leaves and sets up shop, and then just gradually it just kind of builds and becomes that hub. Cambridge is a bit like that in the UK, where there was a couple of agencies, and then someone leaves, starts their own thing, and then it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and all of a sudden you've got 7, 8 agencies all churning out 10, 20, 30, 40 staff, and then someone else leaves and sets their own thing up. And is that kind of how those kind of hubs form in the US, where someone leaves, starts their own thing, and then it's just over time because I'd imagine it's just on a different scale than over here to the UK. Every time I look for industrial design jobs and keep my eye out to see who's hiring and things like that, it's always the US, that's on another level to other parts of the globe, really.
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely a major hub of industry. And based on a couple of my friends who have started consultancies, that's basically how it worked. They work at Fuse Project or Astro Studios or, one of the other prolific agencies, and they just start their own thing. That's basically a good sort of model for getting into the consultancy game. Yeah. But one other thing I remember about the European market versus the American market, as it related to sunglasses and eyewear specifically, was that the European market would lean more heavily on brand aesthetic, or just brand in general, and just sort of like the voice of the designers. Whereas Americans were much more likely to buy something if it just looked good on them. So you could slap like Tom Ford, that's like a very reputable eyewear company. You'd slap Tom Ford on a piece of eyewear in Europe, and it could be like a totally wacky, crazy frame. People are still going to buy that frame. In the US, they're going to be much more discerning, and they're going to say, no, I look stupid in this. I'm not going to buy this. So I don't know if that's like across other product categories, but with eyewear, it was a big deal. Like it really mattered a lot.
I wonder how. I think you actually, that's probably quite astute, because a lot of people would want Ray-Bans more than they would want, the right size and proportion to fit their.
My Ray-Bans are probably too small for me, but I'm in Ray-Bans, so.
From my point of view, I would echo, John's points, really, because I've worked in Europe, UK, and the US. And I would say there's probably it probably comes a little bit from the history and culture, in that the US is driven by industry. So like pragmatism and functionality is huge. And often that's something that you associate with maybe some of the Nordic countries. But bear in mind, like the US it
used to be a huge manufacturing hub until it wasn't.
But again, like there's a huge sort of Nordic influence, certainly in those sort of scales. But then when you look at, you mentioned France, and even the UK, it's more sort of craft like in the UK, that sort of tradition and almost willfully staying a small company with only a few people that like hand roll a piece of steel for 8 hours instead of just press it out. Like that's why we have Ford, and that's why we don't have Leyland DAF. You know, Austin Motors, or basically Jaguar is now part of, what is it? What's Jaguar part of now? It's part.
I'm not sure.
Right?
Something. One thing I noticed through doing a lot of recruiting with Shark Ninja, which is an American-based company, one of those companies in the UK where they're quite big employers now here in the UK, but you don't really understand just how big they are because no one really owns a shark over here in the grand scheme of things. But it's a bloody massive company out in the States. And one thing that we realised quite early on was that actually in the US, it's quite black and white when it comes from like industrial design to mechanical engineering as a skill set. And so why they looked at the UK market is that actually you find pockets of people that are a bit more blended too. So more of that kind of what you would call a product design engineer, I think, in terms of title.
Yeah.
So that cradle to grave, don't really see that as much from an educational standpoint out in the US. So that was one of the reasons why they looked at the UK market quite heavily, is because that skill set was more aligned to what they were looking to get out of things. Probably just a byproduct of lots of Dyson people they brought on, and that's how they were educated and wanted to kind of replicate that and scale it. But that was just one observation, that to answer that question loosely, was that in the US it seems quite black and white in terms of industrial design and mech engineering, whereas in the UK it can be a little bit more fluid between the two. And that's even, you can amplify that by 100 when you go to a market like Australia, where about like 8 people can do product design in that country. So it's like they just do everything. So maybe that's because there's less people doing it. They just a bit more generalist rather than like specialist. We tend to end every podcast job with asking the same question. We've had some really weird answers to this question so far. One particular about breast milk fridges or something, Drew, which was quite a fascinating one. Last time. But we ask every guest about strangest brief they've ever been given.
Strangest.
Now, and I didn't know whether you had, maybe from your freelance kind of stuff, if you ever looked back in time and thought, a bit Dragon's Den or is it Shark Tank? Is that the American equivalent of Dragon's Den? Is there any particular weird and wacky things you've ever been sent across to you over the years?
So here's the thing. I try to forget about them. Like I try to just sort of block them out mentally because they're so upsetting. But I get them like monthly.
Okay.
In terms of, I don't know if I can pick any one particular one. One sort of weird product that I worked on that's sort of in the line of like just kind of odd things like catheters I helped to design a line of toilets for Kohler when I was at Deep Design. So that was kind of weird because you get really into toilets, and even as a designer it was something that I never really thought about. And I remember the engineer that I was speaking with, I was asking him some practical question. I was like, wow, you really know a lot about this stuff. And he's like, yeah, I'm really into toilets. And I was like, okay. That was definitely the strangest one that I can remember. But I could look through my DMs on Instagram. They always come through Instagram for some reason.
Oh, really?
Okay.
I can look through at some point, and I'll get back to you if I can find something.
So I was going to ask, what do you think is like next, or where's it going for you?
For me personally?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. I'm having a blast. So I've been working with a whole bunch of startups. I'm going to keep doing the wearable tech stuff. I'll keep doing the medical devices. I'm going to keep doing the YouTube. It's been a lot of fun, and thank you guys for having me on. I appreciate it very much.
Well, thanks for coming. It's been nice.